Welcome to our interdisciplinary lecture series. This is our last lecture this semester and this year, ending on a very happy note. I'm delighted that Elliote has accepted our invitation and voluntarily made his way to Cairo just to be with us on this occasion. Before I introduce him, and I don't really think he needs any introduction, given the crowd is in the room, I just want to make an important announcement. The Center for Translation Studies will be celebrating its 10th anniversary on December 10th, 2019. It's almost 10 years to the day of its launch, and we're partying a big launch with an anthology, a volume that includes many of the lectures that were delivered at the center over the past 10 years. And the anthology is entitled In the Shoes of the Other, Interdisciplinary Essays in Translation Studies from Cairo. A long time. It was a very long time also to put together this title. So please join us. I know it's a bit early to be speaking about it, but we just finished the manuscript, and so we're very excited about it. Okay, so this afternoon we are hosting Elliote Colla, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies at Georgetown University, specializing in Arabic literature and culture. He's also a prominent translator of modern Arabic literature and an accomplished novelist, of course, whose novel has been made into a series by Channel 4. Maybe you can talk to him about that later on. He's published widely on Arabic literature and poetry, and among his publications is his noted work, Conflicted Antiquities, Egyptology, Egyptomania, Egyptian Modernity, that was published in 2007. He is also the translator of Ibrahim Aslan's classic, The Heron, and Whorf by Indian novelist Ibn Ali, and Ibrahim Al-Khali's Gold Dust, that was nominated as a runner-up for the prize in 2009. His own novel is titled Baghdad Central and was published in 2014, and as I said, is now available, partly available.
It's coming out in September.
Okay.
On British Publishing.
Okay. And Elliote is currently working on forms of revolutionary poetry in Egypt, trying to establish connections between different moments of revolt in Egypt since the 1940s, all the way down to 2011. By the time I'm done, there might be another moment. But anyway, today's talk, as you can see, is titled provocatively, Are We Even Translating? Reflections on Working Between Arabic and Standard Average European Language. And without further ado, please help me welcome Elliote Colla.
Just to begin, I want to say how thankful I am to Professor Mehrez, Professor Ozul. It's a real honor to be here. The center has done, there's nothing like it, not just in Egypt or the Arab world, but I don't know of any other center for translation studies that is so active and so useful for those of us who want to think about translation. This is a real coup for AUC to have it here, and it's a real honor to be here. There isn't much honor in the place where I come from, so to be invited so generously is wonderful. So I'd like to begin today by sharing a draft translation of the opening lines of Ahmed Fuad Negam's poem, Nixon Baba. Now I assume that everyone in this room, and by the way, my daughter tells me always to stop shouting. My speaking voice is sort of this. Can everyone hear me? Sure. So if I sound like I'm shouting, it's just my speaking voice. I apologize. So I assume everyone in this room knows this poem and that there are many here who could produce far better translations of it. So I just offer this translation here today, even though I know that translations of poetry tend to lose meaning, and sometimes they lose almost everything in translation, and that may well be the case here. What I've produced aims to convey merely semantic sense, and what it fails to impart, of course, is the intense sound play of the original. And just to think of the original for a second, and Negam's poetry wasn't composed to be on the page in the first place, right? It's the original in that sense is a performance. So the print editions, even in Arabic in a way, are already translations of another text whose, and if we think of these translations, each one of them from the oral performance to the page as a disembedding of a text from a context, right? And then to move from the Arabic page to the English page is another disembedding. I want to kind of think about the bed and disembedding texts from context today. Negam is justly famous for his internal rhymes and his puns, and he's famous also for inventing words and playing with nonce and nonsense. These qualities, along with his blunt and wily political stances, are what make him arguably the greatest colloquial poet of this country. Like other movement poets of the 1970s, and so part of the study I've embarked on, is thinking of Negam among the dozens of other mostly colloquial poets of his generation, and seeing that for every Negam there's many, many other figures that also deserve some attention. These qualities there's qualities of his poetry that make him stand out amongst this larger group of movement poets. Negam frequently dwelled on Sadat's many somersaults, his gaffes, and his weaknesses, and this poem, Nixon Baba, does just that, and reveals also the degree to which he was cognizant of Nixon's own disgrace in the United States. In this regard, it's worth noting that Negam had been watching Nixon for years, and had composed another poem about him 5 years earlier. So this is the second in his Nixon poems. The point of the poem is not merely to satire the American president, although it does that. Rather, it's to ask why Sadat's group would invite such a disgraced leader in the first place, and why, in the second place, they would pretend that hosting Nixon was such an honor in the first place. The opening lines of this poem beg this question of honor, first by attaching Nixon's name to Watergate, and attaching them by means of this word attack, right, which performs its function in a slightly rude way. The work here is tonal. To refer to Nixon as the Watergate guy or Mr. Watergate man is to make the audience complicit with the judgment and stance of the poet. Once this work is performed, we can now appreciate how ironic the first word of the poem is, sharaft. Idiomatically, sharaft is used to politely recognize the presence or arrival of a guest. Its conventional meaning is to honor, even if that sense is not always explicit in usage, right? I don't think when people say sharaft, they necessarily are invoking some deep sense of honor. I think it's, so throughout my talk today, I'll be talking about the difference between usage and maybe base senses of words. Thus, a more correct but clunkier translation of the base meaning would be, you have honored us with your presence, which completely misses the point and the tone of Negam's poem. The attachment, though, to Watergate shows how empty the polite phrase is in the case of a disgraced Nixon. In 1974, Nixon had no honor to present to anyone. The first stanza goes on to recast Nixon's busy tour, and this is almost the last line of the Arabic, Shilak ya ashab al-bayt, has been, for some reason, it just got eliminated from this slide, but most of you, I assume, know it. So this is the complete first stanza, and it recasts Nixon's busy tour his meetings with the leaders of wealthy and poor countries in 1974 as a form of frantic pilgrimage. It's useful at this point to note the structure of the poem. Each stanza contains 10 lines with a regular rhyming pattern of A, B, C, C, A, B, A, and so on. It continues. And there's lots of internal rhymes. Ima, Wasima, Amalulik, Farashulik, Sayir, Dair. And in the stanzas that follow, there's some other wonderful rhymes like Gawasisik, Yom Tashrifik, or Ahlim Wagatin. The first 7 lines of each stanza, and this repeats throughout the poem, build on a particular theme, while the 8th line returns us to the same initial strong rhyme of the 2nd line, this 8 sound, right, at the end, Watergate. The sound repeats 4 times in the first stanza alone, and the 9th and 10th lines repeat the same in each stanza that follows, and thus function as a refrain, which ends in the same 8 sound. When performed as song, the chorus and audience invariably join in for these last 2 lines. Together, the first lines function as a kind of call, which is then followed by a response in the form of a refrain. And so all of this becomes alive in performance, right? But on the page, it's not so obvious. And, this is true both in the Arabic page and even more so in the English page. The refrain makes the claim that Nixon's visit and pilgrimage is a kind of mulid, a word that conventionally refers to the folk Sufi carnivals that take place on the birthdays of venerated saints, but as Professor Mahrez and others have reminded us, in idiomatic usage, it just simply means carnival or chaos or madness. Like the madness of the large crowds that chased after Nixon and Sadat's rail procession through the Delta in June 1974, which was evoked in Yusuf el-Qaid's 1976 novel, Yaqtut fi Masrullah. So this last line, which has disappeared here, but I think some of you know it, Shilat Yashab al-Bayt, right, evokes the language of Mulid again, since this phrase is used to call for the intercession of the same Sufi faiths, like Shilat Yasin, right? In such invocations, Ashab al-Bayt would conventionally refer to the Prophet Muhammad's family or house, Bayt, right? But in popular usage, the phrase shileh is also used to convey simply disbelief at something, inconceivable or outlandish. Each time the phrase appears, it suggests that the reference might be instead to those hosts, Ashab al-Bayt, who have invited Nixon into the nation's home. So if so, then it's entirely laughable, because no help can be expected from them. Now what I want to point out is how much of this depends on cultural resonances around words and phrases that would be familiar to speakers of Egyptian Arabic, but utterly foreign to American English speakers. And you will notice that these resonances are all absent from the text on the screen. In order to render these resonances, I need to supply exposition, like I'm doing here, or a lot of footnotes. However, such exposition is entirely contrary to the spirit of Negam's poems. He's a poet of wit, which is to say economy. Moreover, we might even say that Negam sought to create and explore the gaps between various kinds of audiences, those who get it and those who don't. And in fact, this comes up if you know of the Nixon Baba court cases that you can find in Salah Isa's wonderful book on Negam, where he chides the prosecutors for not knowing how to read poetry. So every time they try to get him on charges of incitement, tahreed, he shows them that they don't know how to read the line of poetry. They're wonderful examples of literary criticism from Negam, and they should be better known. So I want to come now to what looks like it might be the easiest word to translate in this entire stanza, and it's the word Baba. However, it turns out to be one of the hardest things to translate, at least economically. You might ask, why is it so difficult? It's a common word in Arabic dialects. I've rendered it here as daddy, but in so doing, I'm not sure I'm translating anymore, and I want to tell you why. I'm not rendering meaning any longer when I do that. I'm not rendering meaning in the sense of denotation. I'm doing something else, and I want to explain. So Baba might be rendered into English in any number of ways. Father, Papa, Pops, Dad, Daddy, Paterfamilias, and so on.
Each of these English words captures some or much of its denotative sense in Arabic. At the same time, in usage, when it comes to usage, there are significant differences between the word baba and other words for father, so ab or abu and so on. These words may share the same denotative meaning, but there's a wide gap between baba and ab in terms of register, context, stance, and tone. In other words, they don't mean the same thing, at least in usage. To grasp this, we might consider how in some dialects of Arabic, baba is a word a child uses to address their biological father, and also how that father addresses the child, irrespective of gender. While this is true, it doesn't follow that the denotative meaning of the word baba also then is child. Rather, this usage is showing us there is another operation taking place in language. Following Charles Peirce, we might say that in usage, the sense of the word baba is not primarily denotative, but rather indexical. It points indexically outside of language to the relationship that these two people have with one another. Baba is the sound that people in this relationship use when signaling this relationship to one another. It's what children call their fathers, and it's also what fathers call their children when they're being sweet or when they are scolding. The same is true for many other such words like mama, ammu, giddu, khaltu, and so on. But biological kinship does not begin to contain the various senses of these words in usage. Linguists have called this phenomenon by many names, including reverse role evocative. All of them can be used, however, affectionately and ironically by friends and lovers and so on, irrespective of gender. To render these usages involves getting into the structure of human relations in the Arab world, and to puzzle with how to express this lived culture in textual terms. Most importantly, to translate compels us to move beyond the purely denotative models of signification and into the realm of lived life. In Negam's poems, things aren't this complicated. Nonetheless, despite the fact that the phrase Nixon Baba only appears once, it sticks for all the reasons I've just enumerated. To call Nixon Baba is to take liberties towards Nixon and to create a highly ironic stance. And if you have ever laughed at it, it means that Negam has succeeded in moving you to share this attitude with him. Rhetorically, he has made you complicit with his judgment. Now let me give you another example of a simple word that turns out to be not so simple after all. It comes from my experience of translating The Harem, Ibrahim Aslan's classic novel. While I was working on the novel, I began to notice that the word qala, or ad in colloquial, appears an awful lot. Obviously, the verb he said, the conjugated verb he said, appears often in novels, especially ones that contain a lot of dialogue, like Malik al-Hazim does. Even so, because reigning English style avoids repetition as much as possible, I found myself looking for synonyms wherever possible. Repeating the words he said, he said, he said so often struck me as inelegant. At some point, though, I began to reflect on the patterns in Aslan's style, and in particular how speech is rendered in his novel. Sometimes Aslan uses qala or al to present speech within quotation marks. In such cases, a character is the subject of the speech act. And the cited speech becomes the direct object of the verb to say. Sometimes speech, though, appears in quotation marks and stands alone without any verb or explicit reference to speaking subject. Sometimes speech also appears as indirect citation or paraphrase. And with time, these small differences began to suggest to me that something else was going on. When Aslan uses al to present dialogue, he is doing so intentionally. In any case, qala or al was not an unambiguous marker for dialogue in the text. It had other kinds of significance. So this is this is an example from early on in the novel, just to give you sort of a banal sense of how often this is all in one paragraph early in the novel. In this passage, one character, the prince, is trying to keep track of all the rumors going around about the sales of land and property in the neighborhood of Imbaba. At first glance, at least for me, the repetition seemed prosaic and clunky. At least it really strikes me that way in English. And then it took me a while to realize that Aslan was not using the verb qala or add to mark dialogue, but rather to show how much talk is going on. In other words, the exaggerated use of this verb signals a philosophy about language and the world, about chit-chat and idle talk, about people who talk that do nothing, or about talk that is simply not true. Soon after this, there's another scene in which the blind Sheikh Hosni, one of the great characters ever written in literature, I think, divides up a bunch of oranges, taking the lion's share for himself. So in this short scene, which I'm not going to read for you because you'll see it immediately sounds like banal prose, because he repeats so many times over the course of a few lines this verb qala or add. Interesting, he is also using other words in the same paragraph that repeat the same sound. For instance, portocala, right? Portocala, you can hear that qala or ad, portocala. And other words that repeat, when read aloud in Egyptian colloquial Arabic, permutations of the same sound. This happens no less than 14 times over the space of a couple of paragraphs. And it's not the only instance where this happens in the novel. Now, whether or not each instance of these sounds resonates with you, Aslan was a stylist, and he had a point when he was overusing this verb, qala. So there's so many instances of this, in fact, that Aslan's use of the verb begins to resonate with another word, the particle, ad, which obviously comes from the word qala, but in usage takes on a life of its own as an interjective particle that expresses disbelief and incredulity. Social linguists have helped us understand what is happening in such phrases like this. The particle al does more than express a feeling about something, it also contains a judgment on the statement or the event or the character to which it is attached. Moreover, the particle al situates the speaker and the hearer in a particular relation to one another. When we use the particle al, we are inviting or demanding that the hearer join in our negative evaluation or our dismissal of the event, person, or statement. And that is what Aslan is asking us as we read. It's a rhetorical question. Can you believe he said that, or can you believe it? The answer, of course, is no. Importantly, this little problem word, this ad word, allows us to recognize a poetics of talkiness in Aslan's work. The spoken word is the primary currency of knowledge and narrative in the harem, but the spoken word is also opposed to fact and deed. To say that someone says something, in other words, always implies the possibility that what they are saying is merely empty speech, or that it is mere speech as opposed to actions, or all of these things at the same time. If you know the novel, you immediately see how this fits with one of the larger themes of the novel, personified by the tragic character of Yusuf in the Gar, of the paralyzed, ineffectual intellectual who talks but does not act, and who is surrounded by men whose talk cannot be taken at face value. So Aslan published this novel in 1984, responding to a particular crisis in intellectual life in Egypt at the time, but I hope you can see that the same philosophy has resonance in our time as well. In sum, this small word sheds light not just on Aslan's poetics, but on a complete philosophy of language and action. And I don't think I would have come to any of these insights had I not attempted to render this text into English. So I'd like to now come to this question that I beg in the title of my talk. Is this translation? Is this thing I'm talking about, is this translation? On the one hand, of course it is. The questions of linguistic equivalence and difference belong squarely within the field of translation. On the other hand, much of what I have said here does not intersect neatly with the canon of translation theory, at least as it has existed in my own discipline of comparative literature. And in this regard, I found it useful to take up the work of the linguistic anthropologist Michael Silverstein, whose observations have yet to be digested by those of us translation theorists in the humanities. In his essay, Translation, Transduction, Transformation, Silverstein observes that translation theory has been based primarily on what Benjamin Whorf once called standard average European languages. If you remember anything from today, this phrase is so useful to start thinking about the problems we face when we're translating between different kinds of languages that are not what Whorf called standard average European languages. So by that he meant, Whorf speaking, languages whose grammatical structures are relatively proximate and sometimes basically equivalent to one another, and whose cultural contexts are highly overlapping. One implication of Silverstein's argument is that it may be a mistake to use the word translation as if it were a universal. It may be a mistake to abstract a general sense of rendering texts between languages without regard to the particularities of which languages we're talking about. Since not all languages speak to one another in the same way, and not all languages are foreign to one another in the same way. Benjamin Whorf was an anthropologist, linguistic anthropologist working on Native American languages, and he really thought hard about how radically different Native American languages are than European languages. So he's useful for thinking about difference. And as an aside, we might pay attention to the different words. So as an aside, thinking about how we might start to think about translation in more complicated ways, we might think about the different words used in different languages to refer to this process of rendering texts from one language to another. I've always found it noteworthy, and maybe even odd, that the English word translation is borrowed from Latin, just as the Arabic word tarjama is borrowed from Aramaic, tarjama. In modern usage, these terms may not appear so different, but they're in their resonances, right, in the deep metaphors in these two terms, they diverge significantly. Tarjama, in its older sense, referred to a process of summary and commentary and adaptation. So if you know the pre-modern genre of biographies, right, that's the relationship. The older term, here's a question for someone in the audience to answer, I would love to know the answer to this, is how did the older term for translation, naql, how did that become eclipsed by targama or tarjama in the modern period? That older sense of naql, right, is much closer to the Latin term of translation. Right? So something has happened in the modern period there's a replacement of naql by the word tarjama, but I think it would be useful to think about the implications for theory. When working between standard average European languages, the translator may draw upon cognates, shared grammar, and shared motifs. Translators working between English and European languages, for instance, have a linguistic wind at their backs and can draw upon the lexical ligaments that tie English to French and to German, not to mention the classical languages like Latin and Greek. But it's not just language that is shared. There's a shared history of Western Christianity, whether Catholicism or Protestant reform, or the kind of atheism that arises in those forms of religion. There's also a shared history of elite culture that links T.S. Eliot to Goethe, to Shakespeare, to Dante, to Petrarch, and the Greco-Roman canon of the Renaissance. And there are shared institutions of governance, traffic, and cohabitation linking the Roman Empire to NATO to the European Union. So these are obviously broad strokes, and they might be rejected out of hand by many. My point, however, is to suggest, and I'm going to pick on a couple languages here, my point is to suggest that Catalan and Spanish and French may well seem like different languages to those who speak them. To students of Arabic, many of those differences appear as features of dialect, not language. With all respect for the Romance languages, difference is a matter of degree. So if the material on which translation is theorized has come from these closely related or standard average European languages, which share so many common cultural features and customs, then it may not explain the labor that takes place when working between more distant languages. Moreover, Silverstein points out, because such theory is grounded in Saussurean models of denotative language, so by denotative I mean the idea of the signifier signified, which that we use so often in literary theory, because that translation theory is grounded in that Saussurean model of language, it fails to describe non-denotative aspects of language, such as those I've been talking about today. And often it is those features, based in social customs and cultural norms, that prove to be the hardest to translate in an efficient way, like the word mulid or shileh, which are not just wrapped up in popular Sufi practice, but wrapped up also in the givenness of it all. It's because Sufism is so deeply embedded in the history of Egyptian culture that these words are natural and even banal and take on other meanings than their original religious ones, and don't necessarily imply any religious sentiment at all when they're invoked. It's like translating Bismillah as people sit down to eat as necessarily pious, right? Translating these words solely with their religious meaning risks overemphasizing piety, especially when their usage extends beyond piety and often contradicts it. So there are other linguistic but non-denotative aspects of language we also tangle with all the time while trying to disembed Arabic texts for replantation in English soils. For instance, there are the sub-lexical aspects of language that create sense, but not at the level of denotation, or what Charles Peirce would call symbol. We all know this, for instance, how through Genèse, the tri-radical Semitic root system can cast shimmering semantic auras across texts. We don't have Genèse in English, though sometimes we use Latin or Greek roots to approximate this effect. And there are also, for instance, examples of subroot patterns in Arabic. So just to give you two examples, the pair qatpa, right? It hints at acts of cleaving and pairing, which is then elaborated variously in the tri-radical roots of qatata or qatara, qata'a, qatafa, qatama, and so on, right? Similarly, the pair ghamma suggests something murky, which is then expanded across a number of tri-radical roots, such as ghamara, ghamada, and so on, right? All of which retain this gesture of covering an obscurity, albeit with different shades. And in usage, their meaning goes on to diverge even more. A deep awareness of these sound patterns, though, can be found in the canons of poetry and prose. These are not cases of onomatopoeic patterns and words, though plenty of those exist as well. Authors employ such patterns to generate senses that cannot be explained in the Saussurean terms. Moreover, these examples of index and symbol are neither extreme nor rare. They're as commonplace in everyday talk as they are in prestige textual traditions, and they're present in routine family interactions, public speech, slogans, and poetry, religious discourse, and profane discourse alike. The point is, unlike translators from Spanish to French or from French to English, we can't translate these sorts of figures and features, like Genèse, without translating quite a bit of their social and cultural and linguistic contexts. The term Silverstein uses for this process is transduction, which he describes as a process of conversion of energy and dynamics. And in the process of transduction, it is energy, not meaning, that is converted. Silverstein encourages us to loosen our allegiance to the Saussurean model of language and its many derivatives in literary theory, which began by separating the operation of signifier and signified from reference, and all too often posit language as purely textual and separate from social contexts of usage and dynamic communication. And this brings me really to the main challenge we experience when translating between Arabic and English. Our process is not confined to text and language. Because the language of each text is a vessel for cultural norms, values, assumptions, and resonances that do not travel so well. For the unportable aspects of a text, we often have to supply explanations in the form of surplus exposition and footnotes. And that's because we're not just translating individual texts, we're translating cultural environments in which these texts live because we cannot normally assume they'll be understood. The point is, unlike translators working between standard average European languages, I like saying that, we cannot translate these features without translating quite a bit of their social and cultural contexts, right? The term that Silverstein uses for this process, transduction, is the one I think we might pick up. And it's a different process. In the process of transduction, again, it is energy, not meaning, that is converted. And through transduction, the energy of wind or falling water becomes electricity. That's where transduction comes from energy conversion. Friction can occur, and there is resistance during this process. There are certainly inefficiencies and contingencies, but for all these slippages, there are sparks and shocks, and sometimes the lights come on. And I can think of no better metaphor than that for talking about what we do. Thank you very much.
Wow.
Thank you for a very engaging talk, and I'm sure we have questions. People have done, yeah, good. Okay.
First of all, thank you for this detailed, extensive presentation. So I hope to notice that you work with both registers by reviewing colloquial and the standard. So my question is, whether in your translations or will you encounter the single text, both Fusha and Arabic, standard and the colloquial, and if so, how can a translator work with this sort of hybridity or this mixed use of the two languages, and how can a translator show it if he does so?
I'm afraid that's a great question, and I'm afraid my answer is going to disappoint. The lesson for me, I started thinking that Egyptian colloquial Arabic would be easier. It seemed to me I learned it before I learned Fusha, and I feel more comfortable in it. And with time, I learned that it's much, much harder to translate colloquial Arabic than Fusha. I learned that while translating Ibrahim al-Kuni. So let me just say a word about that. Ibrahim al-Kuni's Arabic is not just Fusha, it's at times almost archaic. It's very different. But there is no colloquial in it. Maybe somebody who knows more than I do could spot some, but that's because his mother language is not Arabic to begin with. So when he writes in Arabic, he's writing in something that's not his mother tongue. I found it it was a stabler ground as a non-native Arabic speaker to work with just one register, because then I could control the register more evenly in English and sort of give the same sort of formal tone that he has in the Fusha text. The biggest difficulty in translating colloquial Arabic has to do with what I'm talking about. It is so embedded in a context, a lived context, that is not a text. And in order to bring its significance out, you need to bring the context over. But that, for instance, in the case of Negam, that is completely at odds with the naturalness of Negam's verse, which comes across as very economic, and it assumes a high level of comprehension among the audiences he wants to have, right? There's a question of tone. I mean, that's maybe almost the first thing you notice when you're reading a translation that doesn't sound right, is there's a tone, and oftentimes that'll be, so for instance, the English I speak and what I think is colloquial is not a universal colloquial, right? It's the colloquial that middle-aged white men speak, right? And if I, you know, so that might be appropriate for a certain kind of text and a certain kind of author and so on, but usually it's not. And so the biggest, so this is where I'm disappointing you. I don't know the answer to that, other than experimentation and maybe multiple translations. But the tone is the first thing that comes out wrong, and it comes out wrong more often, I think, with colloquial registers. Yeah.
I don't know if it disappointed her, but I want to say that it certainly are not disappointed in me. If you can go back to the instant law thing, I wanted to point out that despite the fact that it was very interesting what you said about the law, and then I was very impressed by what you did with the Barashura Kausa Sitka, and you translated that as a rolled out the red carpet. What you did here is actually as far away from a translation as we can get, right? And here, my idea is that basically the translator eats the original language, like the tree takes the nutrients from the soil, water, and whatever carbon dioxide, whatever it needs, and then produces something that has nothing to do with the nutrients, right? So basically produce something completely different. It came out as a flower here. Sometimes it comes out as a garlic or something, but this one came out all right. So it's actually fascinating that sometimes you don't go anywhere near the actual words that are here on the page, right? And otherwise, you lose it. Because the English speaker would never understand what it means to pave a path or why this path. You know, it doesn't make any sense. So how often do you find yourself just doing that? You know, you eat it, you think about it.
That's a metaphor that I don't know if we want to work all the way through. But yeah, no, I get your point.
In the fruit of the tree. That's why I said the tree, not the human being. Right?
Right. Yeah. So for instance. There's a line, you know, how do you, so Salatin and Ful was Zayt. So Salatin, so those of you who are, what is Salatin? Oh.
It's both Sultan
And Sultanin. Right, and so this is an instance where we don't have that in English, so, yeah, so sometimes you get it right. So I guess I'm begging for recommendations. Yeah, so sometimes you just adapt. So I made the choice Farashulek of Sitka. That sounded to me, okay, that's a big welcome. So we call that rolling out the red carpet, right? But maybe kids don't. So that might actually be marked by generation and, you know, me. Maybe kids don't say roll out the red carpet. That's the problem. There's like a shelf life to colloquial, right? Or a half, right? It goes out of date. It can go out of date pretty quickly. Not everything, but some things can really go out. Expressions come and go, right? So that's the part. Yeah, Bita. I would, you know, I try to keep it by, you know, calling somebody Mr. Watergate Man seemed to me to capture the kind of the playful rudeness of calling someone. So sometimes you get it right, or sometimes it seems like you get something that sounds as funny in English. The point is to approximate the effect, not the effect of the words, as much as you can.
I have a question. Yeah. It seems to me that you, after years of translating and getting into pitfalls like the examples you gave, finally dawned upon you that maybe we should think outside the box of translation.
Right.
Right? So this transduction is really cumulative. It's something that you just don't come to me, to happen to me, it takes sort of years to acquire that kind of understanding of what it is that you're doing. And if we were to imagine you translated there about 20 years ago. 20 years ago, did you have the same kind of lucid understanding of what you just said?
No. No, I was translating, so I spoke about, I made it sound like it was a simple process of discovery with medical testing. It was not. It was somebody saying, oh, how did you translate ad?
Yeah.
What do you mean? It's like, and then sitting down and then talking with Egyptian friends to say, like, well, how do you use ad? Because my Arabic has never been good enough to use. There's a number of these words, like atere, ad, like these small particles that are doing, they're pragmatic features of language that have to do, they're for advanced learners, and I'm aware of their existence when they're used on me. I don't know how to use them, right? And so yeah, that was by luck. But by puzzling over a problem that I was clear I wasn't getting something right. And then having somebody say, well, how did you do this? How are you going to do this? The other thing was all the titles, right? That, Basha and Bey and so on. These things are, so I think my choice was just to keep them, usually, I think here, which is a failure in a way, but because I didn't know what the equivalent would be. We don't have titles the way you won't have titles. And there are a lot of, so we're missing out on a lot of fun. But yes, it's really honestly, it's through practice and realizing you're learning when you're doing this. And if there's anything I've been lucky to do is that occasionally have moments while I'm working to realize I'm learning things, right? And then they, and then the payoffs are bigger than just, shuffling one language to another. You actually learn something deeper about the languages, either English or Arabic or both. Yeah, so the other thing I wanted to say is that I've been teaching translation seminars in translation, and half of it is a practice seminar. We just, here's a text, let's work on the problem. And the other half is theory. And after 3 or 4 times doing this, I realized the theory had nothing to say about Arabic. So I'm sort of dismissive about it. I don't want to mention names, but there's a lot of really smart people working on a lot of theoretical problems in translating, mostly between various European languages. And none of that theory actually speaks to what we're doing when we're working between Arabic and English, or English and Arabic. And that's what finally led me. And it was actually another person who said, why don't you use the word transduction? That's transduction. So yeah, it's a professor of mine in the French department at UC Berkeley, Michael Lucy, who's just very curious about language and usage. So that's another aspect, is in comparative literature and literary theory, my own education, I think most of our education was really in the Saussurean and kind of that model, so we didn't think about these other aspects. And the reason why these other non-denotative aspects become so important is those are the things that will trip you up most quickly in Arabic, because they're not about a dictionary meaning. The dictionary will not help you. It's about a situation of people speaking.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I have 2 comments to make. One about Baba Nixon. When you translated about your practice, and you mentioned in your lecture a number of names for father, Baba, Pop, Daddy, and so on. But have you thought of thinking, because you're translating poetry to poetry, right? You're translating literature to literature. Have you thought, for example, of the use of Daddy, which is what you chose? I would not have chosen that. How does it work in literature? For example, I'm thinking of Sylvia Plath. When she says Daddy, it gives the effect or the tone of tenderness. But when Huckleberry talks about his father, who is a very mean man, he used pap.
Hmm.
And thirdly, why didn't you just keep it Baba? I mean, people would have figured out, I think, in English, what Baba is, don't you think? Baba? Nixon Baba?
Well, so this is the difference between denotative and
Yeah.
denotative meaning and language in usage, right? So that in usage, Baba is a familiar term. You know, if you call me Baba, you can do that. It would be lovely. But that's because I would assume it's a term of affection and endearment. But if I go call a stranger Baba, it's odd enough that would be notable, right? There's something a little bit odd in the usage. So I'll give you another example. So the question of register, and daddy is obviously not maybe a poetic word in the tradition of Sylvia Plath. I also have to just say, this is what Ivanka Trump calls her father. So there's something cringeworthy about the word daddy now. Like there's associations with the word that are just a little bit, like I don't know anyone who calls their father daddy, but I now have a very strong image of Ivanka. And so there's something off about that. There's other words like papi. Papi, even though it comes from Spanish, in the U.S. it's widely used in this kind of same playful way that's closer actually to Baba than daddy is.
Pap.
I think that's really archaic. I mean,
Huckleberry used pap.
yeah. So, but this goes to the exact same problem of register. This goes to the problem of colloquial and register, because the colloquial, you know, there's another usage of daddy, like daddy-o, like the 1950s, right? Like, what's up, daddy-o? And it's funny because it's so archaic. This is what my grandfather would say, right? So this works arguably. So daddy might work now. Maybe it doesn't work now. So there's actually, I think that's a fair thing to question. But then 5 years from now or 10 years from now, it might just be really odd. Yeah. I hope that's an answer.
Thank you. So I'm a comparative lawyer, so I'm looking at things from a completely different perspective. But I really liked your analogy, or you're looking at this common standard European language.
Standard average.
Standard average. So would you like to say it one more time?
Standard average European language.
Because then it's like, so I'm pretty sure that in Catalan, there's a number of expressions that speak to the Catalan experience. It wouldn't speak to the Spanish or the French, right? And so in that sense, you think that translators don't actually pay the same attention to these subtle degrees of text embeddedness in the Catalan experience as we're doing with the text when we're translating from Arabic with a register or varying into another non-Arabic language. So then, in the sense is, so the fact that you don't pay attention, or you have a significant less degree of attention when translating from Catalan to Spanish, does not change the structure of the operation. It's just that the transductor or the translator just say, okay, whatever, you deal with that. You go and discover what the embedded meanings are. I won't deal with that. And so in that sense, going back to the text that you translate, especially in poetry, then I'm thinking, this text would need to be adapted if we were to make it legible, for instance, to a Lebanese audience or an Algerian audience, right? So, and probably then you wouldn't. So is it a question of being particularly attentive to something that, so if you're working within a similar, world of languages, you don't, and then if you try and cross and bridge this new issue?
Let me try to be more careful than maybe I was earlier. So my point is that translators working between these standard average European languages, there's a lot that can be taken for granted. And I appreciate the analogy you're making. So between, say, Negam in Egyptian colloquial Arabic versus other dialects, right? Because I think that's right on, and this problem would come up in any kind of language. But the difference, and it's maybe a smaller difference than it. I don't want to make it too big. Is that that we talk about Catalan and Spanish and French as separate languages, but the analogy should be maybe they're so close to one another, and this is what the point I'm trying to make is these would be in the Arab, the equivalent in the Arab world would be dialect differences, and then you're absolutely right. The same issue would hold, which is that the texts are embedded in context, and they have local meanings, right? They have, and there can be wide variation. There is wide variation among Arabic dialects, right? So I'm not saying that it erases difference. I'm just saying that differences might be ones of dialect. But now when we talk about European languages, we're talking languages as opposed to dialects. Yeah, and so the basic point is what can be taken for granted in those, in those. And I think there's just a lot more that can, just as there's a lot that can be taken for granted when you're translating between Egyptian colloquial Arabic and Lebanese colloquial Arabic, right? There's a lot that can be taken for granted. You don't need to explain that Allah is the word for God, right? It's like, or that an invocation of Allah doesn't mean you're pious, right? So there's a taken for grantedness.
In a way, it's trickier though, right? Because then it might be the same expression, but it might have very different.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
But so my point is that these would be, we could think of these differences more as differences of dialect than language. Yeah. There are a couple of hands in the back there.
I just wanted to say real quickly that for me, like, I thought that Danny Nixon was a very good translation because, like, you know, maybe I'm French being a little younger, like, that seems deeply sarcastic and, like, very, like, spot on. So, and I think Pat was a little bit outmoded, so I don't want to, you know, give any advice, but I think that Danny Nixon is a pretty good translation for kind of the tone that they were trying to get across.
I don't think we're going to have to vote on Danny or my context is Greek and Latin, which is easier in some ways because it's no longer a moving target from the origin. There's no additional connotations accumulated for Greek and Latin. But when translated into English, one choice that we always face is trying to find good English expressions that are idiomatic and capture the tone, but also preserve some of the difference. I mean, obviously there's some things that just don't, that aren't relevant anymore to the contemporary English language. So I'm just wondering how you face that problem of trying to produce an English translation that's good English and captures the tone, but also preserves the sense that it is in fact a translation and that you're reading something that used to be in Arabic.
Right.
I don't know if that question makes sense.
No, it does make sense. That the question of foreignization and domesticization is a core question in translation studies. And I actually I appreciate what you're saying to strike a balance. I think there's been at least since the German Romantics, there's been that then gets picked up by modernists, an aesthetics of estrangement and right. So and I think that still dominates today among certain. The high literary value is associated with estrangement rather than familiarity. I've in my own choices for instance, with El-Kuni, who is a modernist in his own way, then I think then the strategy is to present that kind of strain, because the Arabic is not spoken Arabic and it's not even newspaper. It's a classical modern Arabic. So it depends on the text, but I think you're right, it's always a balance between these two. Domesticization has a really negative, or it's seen as simple or facile, but I don't think that way at all. I think you don't want to alienate, we're trying to balance getting people interested and preserving difference. Yeah, I've tried both techniques, and it's not easy to do.
Thank you for this talk. I wanted to kind of shift the topic a little bit and ask you about your translation of Idris Hani. And in my opinion, I haven't read Whorf, neither in Arabic nor in English, but I have read Dongola in Arabic. And I find Idris Hani to be kind of subversive, and he kind of writes in a tone that's a bit angry, and he translates something, not translates, I take that back. He doesn't translate, he writes something that a lot of Egyptians are not familiar with, even though it's happening in their own country or it has happened in their own country. So I feel like in order for Egyptian audience to understand this novel, they kind of have to be or understand the context that they've never been familiar with, which in my head is kind of a bit of a form of translation, because it's something that, he does use Nubian words, I think. I don't know if he does that before.
Less than in his other stuff.
Yeah. So I feel like for Egyptian readers who are not Nubians, this is, a process for them to understand. And then for readers of English, I feel like it would be an even more, complicated process to understand the context of his novels. So I just want to ask you about your experience translating. I feel like it's kind of a double translation in a way.
Yeah. So he's a really interesting writer, and it was really worthwhile and rich to work with him. And what grabbed me about the novel Taht Khat al-Faqr was how angry it was. And I read it when it came out, and I remember, I was here that summer, and I remember thinking, this was so refreshing. He in that novel, he hates Cairo. And if you've ever felt that feeling towards the city, you will know you should read it, because it's an imperfect novel, but there's something really true about that. And that I've never read anything like that before or since. So, and it is coming out of his own Nubian experience as an immigrant and as an outsider. So although he lived his entire, the rest of his youth and his adult life here in Cairo, he really felt, or at least in this novel, he talks about that as exile. And I thought that was really fascinating, to have somebody who's, for all intents and purposes, he's not just an Egyptian Cairene, however, he's Nubian and not right. So the struggle there was to bring out the anger, the tone, but yeah. So there is an interesting thing about it that I discovered while working with it. There's parts of that novel that are. It's an autobiographical novel that just happens to contain scenes that you find in other Arab autobiographical novels, like Muhammad Shukri's Al-Khubz al-Hafi. And so you wonder, how is this happening? So it's just as a work of fiction that also has this autobiographical witness kind of claim, like this happened, this is real, this is my life. It's striking how much of it is based on other literary accounts. And that, if I were working on that as a critic, that's what I would want to explore. How is this autobiography? Or is his experience so formed by other autobiographies? So he quotes quite a bit from Maxim Gorky, and he names Gorky. I don't think he mentions Shukri's name, but if you know Shukri's text, you'll say, while I was reading it, while I was translating, the first time I read it, I didn't see it. But while you're translating, you see things you don't see the first time around. And that's when I realized that there were large parts of the novel, or significant parts of the novel at least, that were coming out of other people's novels.
Well, I have a comment about the question that you raised during the lecture, this seminar. It was about the word knock. In my opinion, as an Arabic native speaker, I think the word in its classical sense, knock, means the transfer of knowledge. I think the point lies with the function of the word. I think it more relates to the transfer of foreign knowledge and applying it to the Arab world society here at that time. About the development of that word from knock to tarjama in the modern sense, in my opinion, or I guess, it has to do with history, I think, because the transfer of knowledge at some point in history stopped from, the Western world. I think that's when the word knock changed into tarjama. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it has to do with history, and everything has to do with history. But it would be interesting to have a real scholarly study of that transformation, because my own personal opinion, so not research scholarly, but an opinion, is that it might have something to do with the rise of an office of translators, or a recurring position, so the Turkoman, the Dragoman, and that it may be coming into Arabic through a whole set of contact places involving the Ottomans and Europeans, and this office and these figures, you see them, especially in the 18th and 19th century, the Dragoman. And that's how the word enters English. So we have a number of words that come from the same root. Targum comes into English in the 15th, 16th century, pretty early. Dragoman comes in a number of different ways, but always along this Ottoman border. So that's where we start getting these aspects of tarjama into English, and it's pretty late. Naql never comes into English, as far as I know. The other thing about naql is I want whoever writes that article to think about naql and baql. That's baql, right? It has to do with the kinds of foods that keep and travel, right? It might, anyway, I don't know if that's relevant at all. It would be fun.
Okay, I think it's between
Thank you.
questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For coming. This is the biggest crowd we've had in this lecture series. So thank you.
And is